right, so we've solved a bunch of problems now. In fact, we've even added a layer of privacy, if you will, insofar as the data is still being sent, yes, but it's not showing up in the URL, which means it's not going to end up in my autocomplete, which means it's not going to end up in my history in the same way, which is indeed great for anything private like credit cards or the like. But what more can we do here? Well, as we've often done in the past, let me see if we can tighten up our code a little bit. For instance, could we use a single route and still implement the same application? Now, this might not be desirable, so consider this an example of how you could collapse some of your code into fewer lines. But this isn't necessarily to say it's the right way or the only way to do things, but I do think it's compelling in some cases. As you'll see, for instance, in the problem set for this coming week, wherein we adopt a similar paradigm to try to keep the code a little bit simpler. So let me go back into app.py, and let me propose to do this. Let's just have one route, / that does everything, including presenting the form and also displaying hello so-and-so. But let's support both get and post for this route. So I'm going to say methods equals, and then in a Python list, quote unquote get, comma, quote unquote post, overriding the default, which again is just get. Then inside of this function, what I'm going to do is this. If request.method equals post, then let's do this, else let's do this. In other words, if the request coming in happens to be post, and this is just another special variable inside of the request object, which we imported earlier, turns out there's another variable, if you will, called method, and you can check what is the method that came from the browser. Is it get? Is it post? Is it something else too? And if it is, let's go ahead and do this. Else, if it's not, it's presumably get, so let's just render the default template. So what can I now do? I can grab this code from greet and delete it. Let me delete the greet function entirely. And I think what I can do is just move all of this functionality in here. Let me fix my indentation. But now, if the request method is post, then I'm going to do exactly what we did before. Else, I'm going to display the form to the user. So what more do I need to change? Let me go back to my index.html. Wherein previously I had an action value of /greet, but this is no longer applicable. There is no more greet route. I just want to submit to /. And frankly, at this point, I can also just get rid of action altogether because the browser by default will assume you want to submit to the same URL from whence you came. But to be explicit, I'll go ahead and leave it for now. Let me go back now to my browser tab and go back. Let me reload to get the very latest of everything. Let me go ahead and type in David and watch now that the URL does not in fact change to /greet, but I am in fact greeted. There's no /greet anymore, but it was in fact sent from browser to server using post, and my web application now using just a single route is handling both methods now in this case. All right, so we've tightened things up, which might be useful for larger web applications wherein we might want to not have as many functions and complexity in our app.py, but what more can we now do? Well, it turns out Jinja, the templating library that Flask uses, has its own documentation page. And frankly, it's super long, but there's some fairly simple features documented therein. And I'll show us at least one of them here. So at Jinja, thus far, it allows us to place values inside of those curly braces. It also allows us to do that block feature, which is really templating by definition, to grab the contents of layout.html and plug in this particular template's block of code. But we can do other things conditionally even in Jinja as well. So for instance, suppose I want in app.py to just get rid of this logic whereby I am not only getting the form from the value from the form, I'm also passing in a default value in app.py. Suppose that I want to relegate these default values to the templates, because after all, if the templates are what the humans actually see, it's pretty reasonable then for whoever is creating the templates, put the default values closest to the user in those templates. So this is to say, let me just get rid of this default value of name, for name of quote unquote world. And just no matter what is in the form, go ahead and just pass it into the template. And frankly, as before, we don't strictly need this variable at all. I can get rid of this whole line 9 and just replace name equals and then the return value of request.form.get quote unquote name in order to get that value. Same thing, just getting rid of a variable if nothing else. But I have gotten rid of 2, the default value, quote unquote world. How can I restore that? Well, here's what's cool about Jinja and templating techniques in general with web programming. If I go back to greet.html, I don't want to just blindly say hello, comma, name, because name might be blank. It might not have an actual value. But it turns out that's okay. What I'm going to do here is the following. Instead of just saying hello, I'm going to go ahead and say hello, comma, and then if there is a name value, then let's go ahead and spit it out inside of these double curly braces. Else, if there is no name value, then let's go ahead and spit out the word world. And then, as before, use end and the same name as the first tag, and if. So we haven't seen the syntax yet, but it's clearly similar in spirit to the block syntax. And this is Jinja's syntax for doing something conditionally. If name has a value that's not empty, like quote unquote, then go ahead and just display the name right here. Else, if it is a blank value or absent altogether, go ahead and spit out world instead, and that's it for the if conditional. Now notice I've used like several lines of code here, which seems weird because I don't want it to say hello, comma, and then the person's name on the next line. But remember how HTML works. It's going to ignore anything more than a single white space. So even though the name or the word world are on different lines, all of that white space is going to get collapsed into a single space visually for the user in the browser. So if I did this right, let's go back over to my tab here, and let's go ahead and hit reload on the page itself by clicking on the URL and hitting enter. I didn't want to hit Command R or Control R because I don't want to resubmit the form. I want to reload the page, and the best way to do that would be indeed to just go ahead and click on the URL and hit enter. Let me go ahead and type my name in and click greet, and hopefully there I am again. Hello, comma, David. If I view page source here, notice you see the template, and you even see that my name is on a new line because that's where it was in the conditional, but the browser doesn't care. It's consolidating all of that multiple white space into a single white space instead. So that's a lot of examples just to say hello world, but the overarching goal here thus far has been to implement really the simplest of web applications that takes user input, produces dynamically HTML that corresponds to that input, effectively implementing our very first back end. Of course, all of these examples thus far really just say hello world to the user. So let's go ahead, though, take a break, and when we come back and say, let's say 5 minutes, we will see how you could implement your very own website for a freshman intramural sports program, just as I did like 25 years ago by teaching myself web programming after having taken CS50. Unfortunately, the internet back in the late 90s looked quite like this. I don't know to this day why I used a repeating background image, but that's what the web looked like. But we'll see ultimately how you could implement something like this when we return in 5 minutes. See you soon. All right, we are back. So back in 1997, the way that Harvard undergraduates would register for freshman intramural sports, otherwise known as frosh IMs, was they would pick up a piece of paper, they would write down their name on it, they would like check off a box for any of the sports that they wanted to participate in, and then they would walk across Harvard Yard, open up one of the dormitory doors, and slide the sheet of paper under the door of what's known as a proctor, a resident advisor who was running the sports that year. Suffice it to say, there was an opportunity to move all of this online, even though the internet itself was still rather in its infancy, or at least as we now know it. However, I had already taken CS50 in fall of 1996. This was probably the spring or fall thereafter. And I decided, even though CS50 at the time didn't even introduce people to web programming, I actually tried to learn a bit of it on my own. And I undoubtedly did not do things very well, and certainly not the best way possible. But at the time, I taught myself a language called Perl, which was very popular for web programming. Nowadays, we have languages like Python and PHP and Java and Ruby and JavaScript and many others as well. But the point is that even after just CS50, maybe one other programming course, you really should have this solid foundation via which to teach yourself new languages, much like the trajectory we've had you on from Scratch to C to Python to SQL to JavaScript, and now bringing it all together in the context of web programming. So let's, without the ugliness, recreate a little bit of what I built way back when to allow students to register for frosh IMs via a web browser instead of a piece of paper. Let me flip over here to VS Code, where in advance of this demonstration, I prepared a few files based on the hello demos from before. In particular, in a frosh IMs directory, which I created anew, I have the following files already: app.py, requirements.txt, and templates. And inside of templates, I have index.html and layout.html. And let me go ahead and hide my terminal window. You can see in the latter the following layout, which is identical to what we used a moment ago for our hello examples, but I've changed the title from hello to Frosh IMs. The index template, meanwhile, extends that layout, or equivalently inherits from that layout, but I haven't put any body inside of this block here. I deleted what we had before, just so I don't have to type as much to get us started now. And then in app.py, similarly, I copied the first couple of lines of code, but deleted all of my routes just so that I, again, don't have to type all of those from scratch. But let's go ahead now and implement the simplest of registration forms for some number of sports. And what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to go over to my index.html, which again extends already layout.html, and let's begin to put together a registration form. I want this page to very clearly be about registration, so I'm going to use like an h1 tag, and I'll say register, for instance. And then below that, I'm going to have the start of a form tag, the action of which I could make anything including slash itself, but let's keep things clear, and let's have the action be /register for this one. And the method for this one will be quote unquote post. Inside of this form tag, notice now, I'm going to have an input. I'm going to turn off autocomplete as before. I'm going to turn on autofocus for that input. And I'm going to specify that the name of this input is itself name, because this is going to be for the student's name who's registering. The placeholder value I'm going to use is capitalized name to make clear in gray text what they should type in. And the type of this, just to be explicit, is indeed going to be a text box. Now I'm going to introduce another form element that you see all over the place on the web. Even if we haven't necessarily had occasion to use it ourselves, I'm going to have a select menu, which is equivalent to a drop-down menu in a browser. And the name for this menu is going to be sport, because I want this drop-down menu to be a list of sports that the student can select. Inside of that, let's come up with 3 sports for now. Option, value equals basketball. And then inside of the open tag and close tag for option, I'm going to just repeat myself, basketball. Then below that, I'm going to have another option whose value is going to be soccer, American football in this case. Then I'm going to type soccer inside of the open tag and close tag. And then the third and final option will have a value of quote unquote ultimate frisbee. And then inside of that open and close tag, I'll say again, ultimate frisbee. So this clearly evinces some redundancy. However, what this reveals is that with the select menu, much like with links, with the anchor tag, you can have the human see one thing, but the value actually used is another, even though for simplicity, I'm keeping them exactly the same. Now, let me go ahead and go into my other tab, which up until now has been saying hello, David, and hello, world, but I haven't stopped running Flask. And so if I keep doing this and reload, if I keep visiting this URL, I'm going to keep seeing that form. And if I type in David, I'm going to click greet because my previous web application is still running. So I can't just start making a new web application and expect that this browser tab is going to work, even though it's still port 5000. Let me go back to VS Code, open my terminal window, go to my very first terminal, wherein we see all of the logs from Flask that have been running. And in fact, among the error messages there is actually some diagnostically useful output sometimes. What Flask is showing you in this terminal window, even though I've hidden it most of the time, is a log that is a recording of all of the GET requests and all of the POST requests that came from a browser to the server. And you're seeing dates and times, the IP address, and so forth, some of which is going to be not very useful in this environment because we're using a code space instead of putting this website on the actual web publicly. Everything is private now to me, but there is some diagnostically useful information there. For instance, this GET request at the top returned a status code of 200, as did every POST and GET below that. But this, too, is, again, where we'll see any errors. And if we start introducing SQL before long, we'll even see copies of our SQL queries so that we can diagnose any problems in those. But this is all to say that I don't want Flask to be running in my hello folder anymore. So I'm going to hit Control-C to interrupt that. I'm going to hit CD to get back to my default folder. I'm going to type CD Frosh IMs now, which my other terminal was already in. And indeed, if I type ls in here, I see those same files. But now I'll clear my terminal, and I'm going to rerun Flask run in my Frosh IMs folder. Turns out that's going to open up the same port, 5000 by default. So in fact, I can just directly go back to this tab, which previously was my hello app, and just by reloading that URL, enter, now I see, not found, 404. So I've clearly broken something, But why is that? Well, I don't have any routes in this frosh.im's application yet because I started almost from scratch. So let me go ahead and close my terminal window for now and go back to app.py, and let's just start serving up that default template quite simply. Let's do app.route as before, quote unquote slash. Let's create a function as before called index, though we could call it technically anything we want. And let's have this function do very little. Let's just return render template passing in index.html. Now, for this new web application, that slash route exists, which means if I go back to my other tab, hopefully it will be found when I click reload. And sure enough, there is my registration form with a name field, and the cursor is auto-focused inside of it with the cursor blinking. And there's my select menu. Indeed, if I click on it, I see basketball, soccer, and ultimate frisbee. So this form doesn't really do anything yet. And frankly, I'm not sure I love the fact that basketball is sort of the implied sport. Like, it would be nice to maybe see a default value or a blank value. That's just an aesthetic detail. If I go back to VS Code here, go back into index, there's a few ways I could fix this. I could do, for instance, option value equals quote unquote maybe nothing because it's a default value. And I could just say something like sport to be sort of a title for that dropdown. Let me go back to my browser, reload, and yeah, sure enough, I now have sport as the top option. But this is a little weird because I don't want the user to be able to register for sport. I don't really want it to be a selectable option. So it turns out there's some other attributes we can play with in this context. And in fact, if we want to display a title like that, sport, we can actually specify that the option itself is disabled, but it is selected by default. So these are two other HTML attributes that you can use with the option tag in HTML. They don't need values, so they don't need equal signs or quote marks. You can just say disabled and selected. But now when I go back to this tab and reload once more, notice that it indeed still says sport, but it's grayed out. So I can't actually submit that value. I can only choose from these three things here. And using libraries like Bootstrap for CSS, you can style these things even more beautifully than this. But this is perhaps the simplest way to at least have a title for that there select menu. All right, I need one more thing in this form. Let me, below my select menu here, let's do a button, the type of which is submit. And then that's going to be a register button now instead of greet. So if now I go back here and reload one more time, now I have the name, the sport dropdown, and the registration button as well. But we're not yet in a position to do anything with that information until I think we implement another route. So let me go back to VS Code. Let me open up app.py. And in addition to my index route, which is just serving up that web page, let's create another route, app.route, quote unquote register. This one, just for privacy reasons, is going to use post instead of get. So I'm going to say, quote unquote, post inside of a Python list there. Let's define another function called register. Though again, it can be anything I want, but I like to name them exactly the same as the routes themselves to keep things straightforward. And then let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and check whether the user has registered or not, and then tell them whether we're successful or there's a failure. So for now, let's actually... Well, let's do this. How about we return this to keep it simple? Return render template, and let's pretend like a template exists for success.html. This suggests that I should probably have a template called success.html. So let's whip one up really quickly. And in success.html, let me do this. First, let me open my terminal and get to a prompt so I can type code. Actually, first, cd templates to make sure it's in the right place. Then code success.html. In this file, I do need a bit of boilerplate. So extends, quote unquote, layout.html with the close quote this time. Then block body over here. Then I'll do an end bloody body. Oh, so close. Block body. Then let's end block down here. And inside of here, let's just say something successful like you are registered. Well, not really, because we haven't actually done the hard part yet. Let me go back now to app.py just to confirm that, OK, when this route is called, no matter what for the moment, we will render success.html. So let's try it. Let's go back to the browser here, type in David. Let's choose, say, basketball for the sport and click register. And internal server error 500, which we know is my fault. So let's go back to VS Code. Let us open up my terminal window. Let's go to the first one that's running Flask run. And I did it again somehow. A template syntax error. Unexpected curly brace. All right, well, where could that be? I did it again, but this time with a different character. Okay, so I was so focused on adding the double quote, I did not add, in fact, the curly. I was so focused on adding the double quote, I did not add the second percent sign. So now let's go back to my internal server error, click reload, resubmit the form that I just submitted, and now I'm told you are registered. Well, not really. That's because the route's not doing anything intellectually interesting yet. It's just rendering that template blindly. All right, well, let's improve upon that. I think what we should require is that to register for a sport, the student should have to provide a name and have to provide a sport. Unfortunately, that is not a current requirement. For instance, if I go back to the form and I don't type in a name and I don't type in a sport and click register, I'm still told you are registered. To be fair, I'm told, well, not really. So, let's make clear that this is a bug. Let's get rid of the parenthetical. Let's go back to the form. Let's not type a name. Let's not choose a sport and click register. Now it's clearly buggy because I am not, in fact, registered. I've done nothing with this information. All right, let's go back to VS Code here. Let's go back to app.py and let's express this idea of if there's not a name or there's not a sport, it is a failure. Do not let the user register. So let's try this. We can express this in a few different ways in Python. I'm going to propose to do it like this. If there is not a value for request.form.get quote unquote name, or there is not a value for request.form.get quote unquote sport, then go ahead and return render template quote unquote failure.html. Else, if there is a value for name and for sport, great, let's go ahead and render template success.html. Now I can tighten this up slightly. Strictly speaking, if I'm conditionally returning a template in line 14, I don't really need the else. So just to type this out, I'm going to remove that altogether. But this is just the same kind of logic we could have done in C or in Python before we introduced Flask or in JavaScript. This is equivalent to an if-else because returning, of course, immediately returns from this register function. So you don't strictly need the else. And I'm doing this just to tighten up the code, but it's not logically necessary. Of course, failure.html does not yet exist. So let me save a couple keystrokes here. Let me copy the contents of success.html. Let me go into my terminal, create another file called failure.html. I'm going to go ahead, just to save a moment in class, to copy paste that there. But I'm going to say this in this template, you are not registered. Now, granted, I'm copying and pasting, which almost always is a bad thing. But when it comes to using templates in Flask, using Jinja here, you do still need lines 1, 3, and 7 to make this work. So those are necessarily copy-pastable or retypable. But now I think we have two scenarios. Let me now go back to the form. Let me go ahead and type in my name and choose my sport and click register, and we're still good. We haven't done anything with the data, but at least the human cooperated. But if I go back now, reload the page, don't type a name, don't choose a sport, and click register, aha! Now we're at least telling the user they are not registered. All right, so we're making progress. We are conditionally checking whether or not the user has actually registered for a sport. Let's now make sure that they can't really, hack us or do something malicious, right? Because right now, if they type in their name and they type in a sport, we will register them, or so we say. But recall that anything client-side isn't necessarily robust. In fact, let me go back to index.html, and let me actually do this. Let me add the required attribute here, and let me add the required attribute here. You don't need to give it a value with an equal sign and quote unquote. Let me go back to my browser and click reload, and now let me try to click on register without giving a name or a sport. Unfortunately, the browser prevents me, or fortunately, the browser prevents me. So let me type in David. Let me not choose a sport. Register. OK, so we seem to have error checking now, preventing the human from submitting this form without valid data. But not quite, because indeed, all of this is happening client-side. If I view source in my browser, I can see the required attribute at the end of the input tag and at the end of the select tag here. But recall that this is my copy of that HTML. And if I want to be malicious, I could control-click or command-click on my viewport and choose Inspect to open my developer tools. Recall from last time, I can look at the elements of this page, pretty printed like this. And notice here, let me shrink the CSS part of this window. Notice that I can actually edit this HTML if I want. For instance, I can sort of click on required, click delete, and then save it. And now the required attribute is gone. I can do the same here on the select field and get rid of that, and now it's gone. And now I can type in David, but I can, for instance, skip the sport and click register, and it doesn't stop me anymore from doing that, because I've disabled client-side validation. Moreover, things can get even more malicious. Suppose that in a protest vote, I don't want to register for basketball or American football, aka soccer or frisbee. Like, I want to register for like actual football, so in the European sense, for instance. So let me go into my attributes here. Let me change the value of soccer to football. Let me change what the user sees from soccer to football. And now, let me go ahead and save that. Now, let me confirm that I've still got my name. But notice now, I can register for football instead of soccer, click register, and now I'm registered for a sport that, at least semantically, is not even supported in the web application itself. And frankly, by that logic, I could have registered for any sport that I happen to type in into the web page's HTML, which is to say we need server-side validation. It is fine to use client-side validation, as by adding the required attribute in places, if you just want to give the user immediate feedback and prevent sort of good users from doing something incorrect or foolishly. You can't prevent the adversaries, the malicious users, from messing around with your form using client-side techniques alone. So let's go into VS Code again, and let's this time open up app.py. And in app.py, let's go ahead and make a canonical global variable containing all of the sports that are officially offered this semester. So let me create a variable, and I'll call it sports in all caps. Even though Python does not have constants per se, still conventional to capitalize the variable just to make clear that you shouldn't change this, and it's global. Let me go ahead and set this equal to the following Python list. This list is going to contain basketball, quote unquote, soccer, quote unquote, and ultimate frisbee here as well. And it's often conventional to have a trailing comma even after the last element, just to make it easier to copy paste and reorder things in code, even though logically it's not, in fact, necessary. What am I going to go ahead and do next now? Well, if I have now this variable containing all of these sports, I don't actually need to hard code them into my template. So I'm actually going to do this. Let me pass in a placeholder called sports into this index template and set it equal to that global variable's value. And now in index.html, let me go ahead and, instead of enumerating all of these sports manually, let's use another feature of Jinja, which is going to make our life easier and much more dynamic, whereby I can use a Jinja for loop instead. So let me go into my select tag here below that disabled option. Let me use open curly brace %, for sport in sports. So notice this is Jinja syntax per the curly brace and per the %, but it's very Python-like. It's very similar to the exact syntax you would use in Python, but there's no colon, and strictly speaking, we're inside of the template here. Below that, let me just proactively say end for, and it's a little weird, but again, this is how Jinja does things. You end the name of the Jinja tag that you began, per its documentation too. And then inside of this loop, let's just generate one option at a time. So open bracket option value equals quote unquote, and this is where templating gets really powerful, curly brace, sport, curly brace, close quote, and then so that the human sees the same, let's do it again out there as well. But technically, those could be different values from what the human sees and the browser sends. So now we don't have 3 sports here manually typed in. We're doing this dynamically because we're passing in a placeholder called sports, but instead of just spitting out its value, we're using a for loop in Jinja to iterate over that loop and generate 1, 2, 3 options programmatically instead. So here is the programming in web programming. We are generating all the more HTML now using some logic. All right, let's now go back to my other tab, go back to the original page, and click reload. I screwed up somewhere else. All right, so let's go back to VS Code. Let's open up my terminal window. Let's click on the first terminal. And oh, name error. Sport is not defined. Did you mean sports? So now Python is very graciously trying to be nice to me here. Yes, I did mean that somewhere. So let's go back to app.py. Stupid mistake. Sports equals sports. So now if I go back to my browser, click on reload, now I have another error. So we go back to VS Code, reopen the terminal. Now I'm just an idiot. So it's not sports with 2 S's. So that was a misclick. Let's delete that and let me stop touching the keyboard. Let me go back to the browser. Let me reload a 3rd time. And there we have it. Very impressive, I know. So now I've got thank you for the applause. Now we've got the name field, the sport field, all of which are still there, but they were dynamically generated based on the value of that variable. So what's valuable about that technique? Well, one, I'm not manually typing out all of these options anymore. And think about the extreme. If it's not 3 sports, but 30 sports or 300 sports or whatever, you don't want to manually type all of that out. You probably just want to have a simple Python list of those values. Or heck, we could even put it in a text file or a database if we wanted. But moreover, now that the server knows what the valid sports are, we don't have to just naively check if there is a value for sport, as we previously did. I could probably do something logically now where I make sure that the sport we did get is one of the supported values. So now we have server-side validation as well. So how can we do this? Well, relatively straightforward. If we have this variable called sports, capital S at the end, I can instead do something like this. I can change my logic to say if there is not a value for name or the current sport is not in the sports variable, then consider it a failure. It's a very nice Pythonic way to let Python essentially search through the whole list of valid sports, checking for the value that the human actually sent. And if it's not there, we are going to return the failure template. So now if I go back to Frosh IMs, let's reload to get the fresh copy of the form. Let's type in David. Let's go ahead and not choose a sport and click register. I still have the client-side validation. That's fine. But let me go ahead and hack that by removing it. Let me open up Inspect. Let me go under Elements inside of this form. Let's get rid of the requirement for the name, even though I gave one. Let's get rid of the requirement for the sport, even though, so that I don't have to give one. Close my developer tools. Notice I still have not chosen a sport. Click register. It goes through, but we catch it. And we tell the user, no, you are not registered. Moreover, watch this. Let me go back to my developer tools. Let me go into the form again. Let me not only delete the required aspect of this from both of those tags, let's also change soccer to football, which, while technically the same sport across countries, is not the same string that we want in the server. So let's change soccer to football here and soccer to football here. And now, close my developer tools, type in my name, but choose an invalid sport that the server does not know about, click register, still catches it. Because now we are doing server-side validation. And I cannot express this enough. If you proceed after CS50, or even for your final project, let alone problem set 9, to implement validation of user input, you should never, ever trust what the human themselves are sending, and you should never rely on client-side validation alone. It's all too easy for someone who's just taken a single introductory course to disable all of your client-side validation. So if you value the safety of your server, the integrity of your data, always check server-side for valid values. All right, so what more can we do to improve this kind of application? Well, we can tinker with the user interface a little bit, if only so that you've seen different UI, user interface mechanisms. Let me go back to the form here, and indeed we have now this drop-down menu, otherwise known as a select menu. Well, there's other ways we could get input from the user. In fact, let me go back to my index.html, and we don't have to strictly use, for instance, a select menu. We can actually use input tags to achieve what are called radio buttons, those little circular things that you can choose among, sort of like old-timey car radios where you would push one button and it would pop another out. You push in that button and it pops another one out. Same thing with radio buttons in the web. They are mutually exclusive. You can choose one, but not multiple radio buttons by design. So how can I do this? Well, in my index.html, let me go ahead and get rid of the select tag there and the select tag here. Let me go ahead and get rid of the disabled option. And then let me just go ahead and still iterate over all of the sports. But instead of spitting out an option tag, which is only relevant for the select menu, let's go ahead and spit out an input tag whose name is quote unquote sport, the type of which is no longer text, but radio, the value of which is the current sport in this current iteration of the loop, quote unquote, and then to the right of it, just so the human has something to look at, let's also repeat the name of the sport. So again here, we're making a distinction, just like with anchor tags for links, what the human sees and what the server sees. But they can be one and the same. Let me go back to my other tab. Let me go ahead and reload this, and my select menu will now be replaced with some pretty ugly, but still functional radio buttons. Let me go ahead and zoom out so it all appears on one line. And now if I type in my name and I select something like basketball and click register, everything else is the same, but I've changed the front end by changing the HTML. Of course, whether we're using select menus or radio buttons, we're still never actually telling the user why they're not registered in those cases where something goes wrong, where, for instance, they accidentally leave a field blank, or even maliciously they try changing those fields. So how can we go about being a bit more informative? Well, let me go back to VS Code here, and inside of our register route, which is doing the validation, let's do a little more validation than we are at the moment. And let me propose this. Let's be a little more verbose with our error checking. And how about this? Let's first go ahead and grab the name that the user typed in, if any. So name equals request.form.get, quote unquote name. And then let's ask a question, just like we did before, but with a shorter block of code. If not name, then go ahead and return render template. But instead of just simplistically returning failure.html with no clarity as to what has gone wrong, let's return a different template, error.html. And let's pass in a specific error message to the template that the human will see that's somewhat informative. And in this case, I'll say aptly, missing name, quote unquote, just so that there's more informative errors. Otherwise, let's go ahead and do this. Let's first get the sport from the user from request.form.get, quote unquote, sport. And then, as before, if not sport, let's go ahead and return an error, but this time with a message. Return render template, quote unquote, error.html, but the message this time will be missing sport. But there is something else that can go wrong here. If the sport the user typed in is not in our sports global array, global list, then let's return render template, quote unquote, error.html, but the message this time will be invalid sport. Now, ideally, users should never see this latter message, at least, because only if they tried to hack our HTML, so to speak, would they actually be able to submit an invalid sport. But for good measure, you should assume the worst, and you should absolutely be handling this error, even if you don't, strictly speaking, need a user-friendly error message for those same adversaries. But otherwise, I think we can assume it's a success, as before, but we do need to create this here template. So let's do this. Let me go ahead and close success.html. Let me go ahead and open failure.html, but now close it. And let me go ahead and in my terminal window, create a new file, code of error.html, paste the contents of failure.html, just so we have a starting point. But in error.html, let's actually have a more useful message. Instead of just saying, you are not registered, let's instead say something like h1 error to make clear that this is an error page, and then maybe put a paragraph of text below it, even though it's succinct, and plug in that message that we passed in via getTemplate. OK, let's now try to induce this here problem. Let's go back to index.html. Let's get rid of the required attributes so that I don't have to keep hacking my own HTML. But let's now go back to the tab with the web application, go back to the form itself, which in its most recent incarnation is indeed these radio buttons, and let me not type a name and not type a sport. Click register in just a moment, at which point previously I saw you are not registered. Hopefully this time I'll see a more useful error. Indeed, missing name. It's not a very pretty page, but at least it's giving me some information. So let me go back and type in my name. Now let me click register without choosing a sport. Aha, missing sport. And if I did again hack my HTML, so to speak, by changing soccer to football, that too would show an error, but invalid sport, according to my logic. Now, just for fun, we could make these error pages look a little more interesting. And in fact, what I'm going to go and do is this. Let me go back into VS Code. Let me go ahead and open up error.html. And below that informative error message, let's use an image tag. Let's specify that the source of this image tag is going to be that of a file, maybe a picture of a cat. However, as I hinted earlier, when we have static files like images or CSS files or JavaScript files, by convention, they should be in a folder called static. So in my HTML, I'm going to literally say /static/cat.jpg. I happen to know already that this is going to be a grumpy cat, hence the error message. So I'm going to give an alternative text for accessibility of grumpy cat, who's internet famous. And now I'm going to open up my terminal. I am going to clear it, cd ... to go back into frosh IMs, where again at the moment we have just app.py, requirements.txt, and templates. I'm then going to go ahead and make a new directory called static, all lowercase. I'm going to cd into it. And then with a wave of my hand, I'm going to go ahead and copy from today's distribution code a copy of cat.jpg, so that now, when I type ls, I indeed have a cat.jpg that I came prepared with earlier. Let's now go back to my browser tab. Let's click reload to still submit a form that's missing a sport, but now we should see, per the image tag we've introduced and the cat.jpg in the static folder, that I indeed now see a very grumpy cat for this error message. Now, using some CSS and such, I can make it prettier and make the cat not take up the entire web page, but for now, we've at least demonstrated how we can have a static file alongside dynamically generated content by putting that static file in the static folder. All right, so now let's actually do the most useful thing and start storing in memory these names and sports for which students have registered. Let's go back to app.py and acknowledge that at the bottom of this register route, all I'm doing is blindly saying success.html, you are registered, even though I've not done anything with the actual data. So it's in app.py that we have the opportunity to save some of that data. And so what I'm going to do is this. At the very top of the file, but below my sports variable, let's create one other variable, an all cap registrants. And I'm using all caps again to signify that this is a global variable, even though it's not constant. Let me set that equal to open curly brace, close curly brace, which even though we've been doing those curly braces all over the place in our templates per Jinja syntax, we are just in app.py now. This is Python syntax from week 6, wherein I've now created an empty dictionary or dict object in Python by using curly braces. This is the same thing as saying dict, open paren, close paren, which just returns to me an empty dictionary, but it's a little more Pythonic just to use the syntax of open curly brace, close curly brace. But why this? Well, if I've got names and sports, that's like keys and values. I might as well store that kind of data in a Python dictionary where the keys are the names and the values are the sports. So how do I do this? It's actually pretty simple. Right before I declare that the student is registered, let's just go into that registrants array. Let's just go into that registrants dictionary. Let's index into it at the name location that I want to put into the dictionary and set it equal to the value of that sport. And I'm simply using the variables that I created earlier for the purposes of doing error checking and using the name and sport in different places. But I'm now using that same variable name and that same variable sport as my key and value pair. Now, as an aside, this is a little naive of me, and it's not the best implementation. As written, this will not let two Davids, for instance, register for two different sports. Why? Because we're allowing one name to overwrite another identical name. So if two Davids try to register for these sports, probably not a good outcome because we're going to clobber or overwrite the previous person's registration. But let's consider a simple world in which there's only one of any name in the world so that we don't have to worry about that just yet. Now, let's go back to my other browser tab, clicking back in that. So get back to the form. Let's type in David. Let's type in basketball and register. Says that I'm registered, but who knows at this point? Let me go back to the form. Let me type in Yulia, and let's register Yulia for soccer. Click register. Claims that she too is registered, even though who knows? But hopefully in app.py, before success.html is rendered, we're indeed adding David and then Yulia and then anyone else to that global dictionary. And so long as the server stays running, that dictionary of keys and values is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But let's see if we can't show ourselves those registrants. Well, maybe the simplest way to do this is to give ourselves a third route. So let me say app route, quote unquote, /registrants. And then below that decorator, let's say def registrants to define a new function called exactly that. And let's keep it simple. Return render template, quote unquote, registrants.html. But I got to pass in those registrants to the template so it knows what registrants to show. That's fine. Registrants equals registrants in all caps. So same convention as before, but I'm providing the registrants.html template with that global dictionary of names and sports. Of course, I need another template, so let's do that. Let me open up my terminal window. Let's go back out of the static directory. Let's go into the templates directory. Let's create a template called registrants.html. I'll close my terminal, and up here I'm going to do the same boilerplate as before, extends quote unquote layout.html, and I'm going to type every keystroke correct this time. Then I'm going to say begin, no, I'm not. Then I'm going to say block body, parenthesis, %, close curly brace. Down here, I'm going to say end block, and then the same. And in here, I'm going to output a list of all of the registrants. And I can do this in a number of different ways, but frankly, I think it suffices to maybe just kind of do maybe a bulleted list initially. So how might I do this? Well, I could do something like an unordered list tag there, inside of which I have a whole bunch of list items, or LI tags. How? Well, I could do something like this. For name in registrants, which is the placeholder, or rather the variable, the parameter, which was the parameter that was passed in. Then let me proactively close that for tag in Jinja. And then in here, let's do li. And then inside of the open and close tag, let's just do name for now. Before we take a look at the effect of these changes, though, I am going to open my terminal window, and I'm going to hit Control-C just to stop the server, and then I'm going to rerun Flask run just to ensure that Flask knows about this very latest version of my code into which I've added that global dictionary. Now I'm going to go back to my same browser tab as before, which is still running on TCP port 5000, and I'm going to try to register a couple of people. So I'm going to register myself for basketball, for instance. And I seem to be registered. I'm then going to go back, and I'm going to try to register Yulia, say, for soccer. And I'm going to click register. And now my hope is that both David and Yulia are in the server's memory in that global dictionary as key value pairs. So if I go up to my URL here and zoom in, and I change register to registrants and hit enter, I indeed see now a bulleted list of all of the names of people who have registered for sports thus far. Now, it doesn't have to be a simple bulleted list, because it would be nice to know what sports we registered for, but that's just a matter of HTML. Let me go back into VS Code and hide my terminal window. Let me go into registrants.html, and we can go all out in this if we want. For instance, let me go ahead and do this. Let me get rid of the unordered list tag there. Let's give ourselves a proper title of registrants, this time in an H1. Let's then begin a table, inside of which is going to be a table head initially. And inside of that table head will be a table row. And inside of that table row will be two table headings, namely name, as well as another table heading of sport. In other words, I want to have a two-column table, if simplistic, that shows me name, sport, or more generally, key value pair. Below the table head, let's go ahead and do a T-body for table body. Inside of that table body, let's now iterate over that same dictionary, but let's do it a little more pedantically, such that I'm going to do for each name in the dictionary in that registrants dictionary. Then let's proactively put an end for below that. And inside of this for loop, let's create a table row for each person. Let's create a table data inside of that row, inside of which is going to be that current name. Then in the second column, via a second table data tag, let's go ahead and put the value of that key, the syntax for which, just like in Python, is registrants, but index into that dictionary at that specific name with curly braces on both sides. As in Python, when I iterate over a dictionary in Jinja here, in this here template, I'm indeed iterating over all of the keys in that dictionary. So if I want to get at the value, I need to use that key, that is name, to index back into that dictionary. Now, if I go back to my browser tab here, previously I saw all of this as an unordered list, but if I now click reload on my registrants route, I now see a big, bold H1 tag, registrants, followed by a simple HTML table, one column for name, one column for sport. It's not the best formatted, but I think if we introduce some CSS, whether my own or Bootstrap, for instance, we could make that even prettier as well. All right, with all that said, I think we have an opportunity for maybe one final version of Frosh IMs whereby we can actually store all of these registrations in a database. The problem at the moment being this. If I go back to VS Code here and open my terminal window and either intentionally or accidentally hit Control-C such that the server stops, or worse, the server loses power, or somehow the server reboots, everything I've stored in the server's memory and that global dictionary is going to get erased by default because I'm going to get a brand new dictionary when the server restarts. In fact, if I rerun the server now with Flask run, go back to that very same tab which had David and Yulia and click reload, all of a sudden we're gone and the table is empty except for that heading. So that's not the best way to persist data. In fact, if that could happen, we might as well go back to yesteryear's pieces of paper to keep track of everything. But I think we can fix this. So wouldn't it be nice